interesting specimen these days, ain't it?
Interesting.
Yeah,
I'd like to see him in counseling. I think that would be like.
oh, there's
Approach when you use with
No,
them.
everybody, yeah.
right. Oh, man, okay, I'd love to talk about that for an hour or two. So, doing an assessment, if you go through your traditional clinical mental health counseling training, and if you do your slalom around ever having to take an addictions class, at some point out in your career, you will be sitting in front of a client about to do an assessment, and they're going to bring up a drug issue, and you're going to go, oh crap, I wish I would have gotten some training on this. Because the world is duly diagnosed. The statistical probability is you will be working with someone with a chemical dependency problem, whether you like treating it or not. So it's helpful just to have some exposure. So if you're doing an assessment and you have to wander into the chemical dependency area, a couple things to remember. You're asking somebody for details that they might be deeply ashamed of, or they might be completely indifferent to, or they might be angrily defensive about. Be tactful in the way that you ask questions. Especially vulnerable are clinicians who have family members that are addicted, that have made them enraged over the years, and a little transference goes on. Feel what you feel, think what you're going to think, but in your outward expression, definitely try to be tactful. Most clients that come into treatment that have worked with me have been court mandated. There's a lot of times there's something hanging over somebody's head. If it's not the court, it's an angry spouse. It's a threat of, I will go to the police and tell them what you did. So, you know, there's a combination there. When you do your assessment, what you put into it in written form could possibly be admissible in a court of law if it's subpoenaed. So you always have to remember that anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Be aware. And I do know some clinicians that will be very circumspect about what they will put in writing, regardless of what the client has said, because you're not obligated to put everything your client says in writing. Be aware of how you might impact their lives. Your job is to gather information, form conclusions, and report from what you gather. It's your client's story to tell or not tell. So don't take on the role of a lie detector. I was doing an assessment once on a guy that, in my mind, clearly just wanted to say the right thing so he could get into the 30-day residential program and have 3 hots and a cot, as they say. Probably owed somebody some money, and it's a very safe place when you go into residential treatment because nobody can get in and ID you without a judge's order, not even the cops, which can make them very mad. I had my thoughts in my head, and I went to my director before I let the guy out of the office. I said, oh, I think this guy's full of crap. I'm not. And her reply to me was, you go with what he says. Your job is not to be his lie detector. So if he goes to residential treatment and he really doesn't need it, he's probably not going to participate anyways, but who knows, it might actually benefit him. So I went back to my office and I put him in. He didn't last long, but that didn't justify my attitude. Our job is not to be the lie detector, we just simply collect data. The role of an assessment in the context of couples therapy is to not only gather information, but begin laying the groundwork for some habits of coupling that could actually be beneficial to the relationship itself. Transparency and honesty are factors that addicted folks have misplaced many times, assuming that it was a characteristic of theirs in the first place. And so what you're doing with them in the middle of this could be the very first steps in helping the addicted partner begin to practice some transparency and honesty. Sometimes details about drug use can blow away the non-addicted part of the couple if they've never heard some of these details. Remember what I just said about honesty? The way they acquire it, the way they use it, recover from it, how they've obtained it, risks taken, the associations that they've had to make in order to make this circus work. It's the metaphor of having plates on multiple poles is not too complex. Could blow the other partner out of the water. So remember the other partners in the room, they're listening to the story and they're forming their thoughts and opinions along the way. It could be stuff that they already knew, could be some new things. How you do the interview can affect the attitude of the other partner depending on how you respond to the person. If you are neutral and respectful when the partner wishes you would just nail them to the wall, well, maybe it's the first time they've seen somebody treat somebody with those kinds of issues in a respectful manner. That could actually be good modeling. So whatever comes up, remember that the other person in the room is impacted by the way you do your assessment. So address it sensitively. I want to show a video of one of the folks that actually authored, oh my, guess I'm not. I killed my video. I can't show it. All right. Well, I was going to show a video that was an interview with one of the authors from the book on the chapter on this. And one of the things, she was kind of addressing the very same issue that I'm talking about here, of being sensitive to that department. Apologize. I diminished that window, and now I don't have it to easily get to. So there's 11 criteria in the DSM that could possibly be a part of the experience of an individual with their addictions. When I do an assessment on somebody with an addiction, one of the things I emphasize right up front is this is not an evaluation of your character. This is not a judgment or a label of who you are. This is a snapshot of what your experience has been up to this point with that drug. I try to keep it very focused on this is what your experience with it has been. If there's any conclusions about character and morality that need to be made later on, I'll leave it up to them to make it. But for my interview, I just want to focus on this has been your experience. How many of these 11 have been a part of it? Substance use disorders are categorized with 3 kinds of specifiers. It could be a mild disorder. And many times somebody with a mild disorder may not necessarily qualify for any kind of treatment. They're one of those people down in the lower part of that pyramid, and maybe they're satelliting there, and maybe they might be some of the people that stay there, or they could, at some point, ratchet it up and go for moderate or severe. If you look, the criteria for picking one of those has to do with how many of the characteristic symptoms they exhibit. Not all the symptoms will be present, and not all of them necessarily stick together. They could experience some of the symptoms at different times of their life. When you're diagnosing, you're looking for a period of 12 months that the majority of them occurred in. So what I do to start with, I passed out a form. Now this is a form I created myself, but in talking with Jeff, he's seen other things that are very similar to this. If you work for an agency that does these kinds of assessments, you've probably seen something similar, or it's been on your computer screen. But I like to start with doing an inventory of anything they've used. And I would say to them, tell me every drug that you've ever tried, even if it was a one-time experiment. Let's go. What, did you use alcohol? Did you use opioids? And I go right down the list and just very quickly come up with an inventory, because I'm going to come back and look at each one a little bit closer. If the person says, well, it's not that important, I used it just once. Well, I'd like to know about it even if it was just once, because I'm going to mention that in my report eventually, that you tried it, you experimented, you didn't use it anymore after that. So you go through each of the ones that they have identified in their inventory one at a time, and you collect your data, because you're gathering information to decide, is a diagnosis warranted? Is the evidence there? There are times when my assessment has been an education for the client, and they've seen how many criterion symptoms have added up, and they came in the office saying, I don't have a problem. And with a general approach, I've gone through the criteria, and they come out of that saying, oh my God, I got a problem. So if you do it well, it can be an education process. I've also had folks that at the end of an assessment, they realized they didn't have as bad of a problem as they thought. And that actually was motivation to snuff out what was left of their problem, because they were closer to the finish line of sobriety than what they even thought. So as you do this assessment, you can turn it into a very interactive, engaging. If you're treating the person, this really is where you're starting to build your rapport. This does not have to be awkward, although many people coming into it will feel awkward. And when you get that vibe, you're going to feel a little awkward too. You can turn it into a relational thing to build rapport with your client, which is pretty much what I just said right there. So, this sheet you have in front of you. Let's talk about some of the different, let's talk about alcohol use disorder. All of the different drug disorders have common language in the DSM, so we can focus on alcohol, but it's going to be very similar for every other drug. So alcohol use disorder, a problematic pattern of alcohol use leading to a clinically significant impairment or distress, manifested by at least two, which was mild, of the following occurring within a 12-month period. Not necessarily the last 12 months, any 12 months. Because that 12 months could have been 10 years ago, and today they're in another specifier we'll talk about, full remission. So, so first criteria, alcohol is often taken in larger amounts or over a longer period than was intended. If you've known any folks that have a problem with alcohol, what might that look like? Binge drinking. When I started off, I was going to stick with 5. And then I found myself nearly every weekend going 8, 10 a day. How long did that take? Oh, about 3, 4 months. And it was just a little snort. Then I found myself doing 3, 4 lines a day. So sometimes it explodes when it was either larger amounts that they intended, or, well, I thought I'd get over this after college. It was just, it was just my college days. I was getting my wild oats out. And then for some reason it became a longer period than I thought. If this has been a part of their experience, they've met this criteria. Persistent desire, meaning I can't get this to go away. I really want this stuff, and I think about it, and sometimes I have dreams that I'm drinking, and I wake up and it's like, damn it, I thought I was getting it. Persistent desire or unsuccessful efforts to cut down or control. I tried to cut back. I was good. I was on the straight and narrow for a couple weeks, maybe a month. And then I drove by my favorite bar and it was right back in. So if this has been a part of their experience with the drug, then you met criteria too. You can follow these along on there. A great deal of time is spent in activities necessary to obtain alcohol, use alcohol, or recover from its effects. Anybody here ever either worked with an addicted person or known somebody that really had an elaborate scheme for getting? Anybody want to tell a story? What kind of hoops they jumped through to get or use?
Yeah, that was me in college.
Okay. How intimate of details do you care to share?
That's it, and
That's
it's like
it?
almost every other person I knew in college. So,
Okay.
and I shouldn't be. I'm not trying to make light of it, but we really did. Like,
Okay.
yeah.
People hiding bottles under, like, let's say, cabinets. People within couch cushions, etc.
Strategic.
Yeah.
It takes thought
Right.
to be that sophisticated. Yeah.
It's like the hair of the dog, like recover from its effects. Well, I'm just gonna have more the
Yeah.
next day, so I don't feel hungover.
Right. making sure my weed was on the table right beside me so I could light up in the morning, because I knew if I woke up and was awake for more than 3 minutes and I didn't have my weed, I was gonna feel really lousy. Well, there's no withdrawal from weed. Yeah, there is. Maybe it's more of an emotional thing, but there definitely is. My dealer is on that side of town. I live on this side of town. If I'm gone too long, somebody's gonna suspect I'm gone. So I gotta figure out how to go to work and swing by through there really quick, but not get seen, and make my way back over here and come up with a story. Sometimes the things that people go through to make all this happen, any school would give them a master's in business administration in the way that they can manage things and circumstances and people in order to accomplish this. A lot of times the activities that go with addiction are as addicting as the substance itself. I've had multiple clients tell me the buzz from the lifestyle, running the streets, being around people that could potentially kill me, leaving suburbia and driving into the hood was actually a rush for some people. So a great deal of time is spent. I can't remember the last guy that I assessed that smoked weed, that didn't smoke it all day long. I guess if you got a job and responsibilities, you can break that up, but I usually work with folks that are not employed and their prospects of employment are pretty poor, and so they've got time on their hands, and they blaze up in the morning and they're just cruising the buzz all day long. Great deal of time. Craving or strong desire or urge to use alcohol, this can actually be present even in advanced stages of sobriety and recovery. Some people bear the crucible of this being present for a very long time. This could be one of the last things that the brain needs to overcome, depending on the drug. And maybe you've heard stories of people that have had 10, 20, 30 years of sobriety, and then on one occasion, they cross paths with their drug. So sometimes this doesn't go away. Recovery is hard work. Sometimes folks coming into treatment haven't wrapped their heads around that it is hard work, and some of that work takes place every day for the rest of their lives. And dealing with cravings can be one. All right, my wireless presenter lost its signal. Failure to fulfill major role obligations at work, school, or home, what might that be?
Being tired.
But I'm functional. I put food on the table. What else is there about being a parent that might not be there if I'm stoned?
Emotional
Yeah.
between you and interaction between you and your family members.
Yeah. That was a question that I would use with somebody who really wanted to put up I'm a functional drug user. Well, there's more to your function as a husband, and more as a partner, as a parent, than just merely going through the routines. The emotional engagement usually is not present when you are stoned and high, is it? No, guess not. But that's not a part of the criteria. So, now when I do the next DSM, damn it, it's screwing up my life. It's ruining my relationships. I've got problems that I obviously know my drug is screwing up, and yet I choose to continue doing it. Or I can't stop. Depending on which philosophy you believe. The use continues even though it's really obvious that that is making things worse. Anybody have an example of what that might look like?
Well, a lot of times, just people I knew, it's when they were drinking and they would get into trouble for drinking or
Yeah.
using drugs. Their partner, their family members, whatnot, and then they would just turn around and say, I need a drink. And they already had a drink, but they needed a drink on top of it to cope. So it's kind of like the alcoholism or the drug addiction was causing anxiety and causing issues, which then caused them to compensate as well.
Mm-hmm. a young man in Toledo that didn't have a driver's license, by choice. And he loved weed. And his impairment was when he smoked a lot of weed, he kind of forgot where he was. And so he would ride his skateboard down the middle of a major highway outside of Toledo. And finally, a police officer pulled him over. I don't know what he said. Bring your skateboard to the side of the, pulled him over, and he got, embroiled with the legal system and became a client of mine. But that was his thing. His weed impaired his skateboard riding, frequently. I know it's a dumb story, but I still chuckle over that one. Not at him, just over that story. All right. So social, occupational, recreational activities are given up or reduced because of the drug use. Things you can't do anymore, things you don't have time to do anymore, things you're too impaired to do, you're too embarrassed to do, you will part with those for the opportunity to use your substance. Use it in situations that are physically hazardous. What immediately pops to mind? Drunk driving, impaired driving. Anybody hear in the news that they've invented a breathalyzer for cannabis to detect THC levels? It's actually a thing, and my understanding is it's beginning to be used because the statistics are showing an elevated percentage of drivers in Colorado and some of the other states that use it recreationally are getting into trouble because they're intoxicated with weed. So we'll see where that goes. I can't even imagine how that works. I know how a blood or a urine test works, but I can't imagine how that works with breath. Riding your skateboard down the middle of a road. A doctor or someone has told you that you have a physical or psychological problem your drug use is making worse. Alcohol affects the liver. I had a client in Philadelphia, a guy in his 50s who looked pregnant with quadruplets because his liver was so swollen that his abdomen was so distended. By the time I met him, he had quit drinking and was trying to be more healthy, but that situation wasn't going to fix itself. He needed a new liver. But I know that, and I still use. Value judgment here, maybe. Brain out of control, maybe. Genetic predisposition. Little of a lot of things. Again, slight equalizer. None of the criteria in the DSM tells you why. They only tell you what. Everybody's equalizer is the why. Tolerance. Either you need more of the drug to get the buzz that you like, or you're limited to using the same amount and the buzz is going down. It could be either one of those. And withdrawal. Characteristic withdrawal for alcohol. I'm actually going to put the criteria up for that. But withdrawal is what happens when you just don't have it available anymore. A lot of times the definition of this comes from the medical and physical effects of not having that in your neurology. I pose that sometimes withdrawal is coming out of an emotional withdrawal too. That's my opinion. That's not scientific fact. So what does alcohol withdrawal look like? They can't sleep. They might be throwing up, hallucinations or illusions, agitation, anxiety. I do not know what a tonic-clonic seizure is. Anybody know? I should have looked that up before this presentation. I didn't. One of the many things I forgot. Anybody know what wet brain is? Heard the term? What is it? Yeah, you're here.
Symptoms can even mimic something like an early onset dementia,
Yeah.
kind of a pretty chronic delirium type of state. That's like I said, chronic, so it's not really reversible, those effects from chronic alcohol use, unfortunately.
They've been using so long, the alcohol has saturated parts of the brain. when I was doing treatment at one of the centers in Toledo, a guy was brought in on a gurney. It was a guy that actually ended up becoming a very close friend of mine, but at the time he was a client. They brought him in on the gurney. It was just out of it. But it was amazing that he could sit up, and somebody leans over and says, "That guy's got wet brain." And at that time, I wasn't really sure what it meant. So they put him into a 28-day detox before he finally ended up in my outpatient group. I want to be careful about the details I share, but they're salient to the story. He was a treatment professional at the doctoral level at this facility for many years. And yet he struggled with the same things that his clients struggled with. When they brought him in, he was close to death. That woke him up. And because he's a friend of mine, I happen to know he's been sober for over 10 years now. But he was about as far gone on alcohol as you possibly could get before you hit that tombstone thing up on the top. People do recover. But Lordy, I wish they wouldn't push it right to that edge like that. Oh, okay, let's hit the floor. What did I miss? Sorry. I have no idea why this is doing. So those are the 11 criteria. When you're doing an assessment, the first thing you want to do is establish a timeline of use. When did you first start? Very first time you drank. What'd you drink? How much did you use? I was 15 years old. I had a couple of Heinekens at a party. And over the next period of time, what changed? So it's like a story of where did their use go. If you got a guy that's in his early 20s and he's only been using for about 2 years, you might say, okay, 6 months later, what was different? Sometimes I assess people in their 70s. I jump ahead decades. Because a lot of times a person can go an entire decade using and nothing changes, an entire decade sober, another decade using. Pick your intervals, depending on how old the person is. And you wrap up saying, well, when was the last time you used? Sometimes people will say, a couple of months ago, last week, last night, in the parking lot before I came in here. I know I'm going to treatment, I needed to have one last go. And when I pee, man, there's going to be numbers. So construct a timeline. If you look on the back of that sheet, I am not reading all that. If you look on the back of that sheet, there's a narrative of what a pretty decent timeline looks like, when they started, where it went, and what ages did things change. Because remember, your objective is to see what took place within any 12-month period. And so this would be the way you would figure out which criteria are met. And I highlighted there some of the different ages. So that's how I concluded that this person met criteria for F1020, alcohol use disorder severe, because they met all those criteria within the same 12-month period. The model. By the way, any questions about the DSM? Pretty straightforward. Yeah. If you work in this field, your clients will teach you subtleties about how to ask questions about different drugs. You won't ask about withdrawal for one drug the same as another if you're savvy about how the different drugs impact people. My clients taught me things. I didn't come equipped with this knowledge. Matter of fact, my clients taught me a lot, and I'm grateful. So I want to hand out an article, just so you have it. If you wouldn't mind. Here's an article on this particular model. This is in the book. And I want to use the remaining time we have just to kind of go over the structure of this model. Statistics say that, I remember what I wrote here, nearly half of the participants, oh crap, I might as well just read it. According to a study published in 2014, researchers found that nearly half of the more than 17,000 study participants with a history of alcoholism got a divorce. Alcohol is a significant contributor to marital problems. So the model that is laid out in the book is the alcohol behavioral couple therapy model. It has been adapted for use with other types of disorders, but in the book it's just targeting alcohol. So some of the background is it draws from a number of different theories to lay a foundation: social learning and family systems. Pulls in a little bit from motivational interviewing, a little bit from behavioral training. One of the things that is a highlight of this model is it requires abstinence. And the reason that they don't leave it open for negotiation is that because of the effects of the alcohol use on the relationship, perhaps the only way that this relationship is going to make any kind of movement is if the person that uses stops using altogether. And it can be regarded as sort of like an experiment in sobriety during the time of treatment. Experiment with sobriety. Let's see what happens if your head clears. Will you treat your spouse differently? Will you make different decisions with a clear head as opposed to one that's still dabbling with drugs? Let's try an experiment and see what happens. So function versus dysfunction. Now this is going to sound a lot like our, that thing that, thank you. Thing that we drop information into. So behind the theory of this is that the primary reason for the relationship dissatisfaction comes from the behaviors of the addicted partner because of the alcohol use or dependence. So in the beginning stages of this treatment model, primary focus goes toward dealing with the alcoholism. It's later in the treatment model that they begin to work on issues of coupling. They did talk about the alcoholic couple, and we had talked about that a little bit earlier, where two folks that are addicted to alcohol find a way to mesh their life and make their addictions work. That also can be addressed. A lot of times, if a drug has been introduced into a couple's experience, the drug use has an effect on the emotional aspects of the relationship, the trust aspects. As those begin to erode, they can have a reciprocal effect back on the way that a person uses. I'm miserable, I use. I'm really becoming a pretty lousy partner. I'm getting a response from my partner. I don't like how that makes me feel. I'm going to go back to using more. Big toilet bowl spin. Intimate partner violence is associated with one partner abusing alcohol as well, to a statistically larger degree. So the structure of this particular modality is you have weekly sessions with your clients together, generally 90 minutes. It's considered a short-term intervention, usually over about a 3 to 6 month period, 12 to 20 sessions. They outline 12 sessions in the structure, leaving room for whatever else needs to be addressed. Every session has a breathalyzer. In the drug treatment world, there's kind of two attitudes toward urine sampling and breathalyzer. It's punitive, it's punishment. I don't like to do it. That's one attitude. It's helpful information, and when they are positive, it opens up a conversation about their using patterns, and it doesn't have to be punitive. I kind of fall on this side over here. I've used breathalyzer and urine tests. They actually open up very honest conversations. The punitive part is how you respond as a clinician to the information. It does not have to be the test itself. Homework. It's a manualized treatment. You all know what I mean when I say manualized. I mean it's been structured, it's been written down. Some people do not like manualized treatments. It keeps me in a straitjacket. My position is manualized treatment keeps you on the straight and narrow of actually doing a modality correctly according to the evidence that's been gathered. When you're really good at it down the road, you can put your own bells and whistles on it. But keeps you doing it correctly for a while. alcohol's the primary focus, it eventually shifts to the relationship. We need to, in this theory, we need to correct the alcoholism first. So the role of the therapist, you are the, like I said at the very beginning, you are an expert consultant. You have the knowledge and expertise about alcohol, alcohol problems, the change methods, and the mechanisms. You may not necessarily be that expert in practice, walking in the room, but how you comport yourself, not lie, not pretend, but how you comport yourself can raise the confidence of your client in your ability to be able to provide some value. So you don't have to try to prove you're a know-it-all, but you don't have to necessarily tell them everything you don't know either. So, a newer clinician can fulfill this role, period. So you're going to work as a collaborator and a coach. You're going to use your expertise to serve them. You're going to avoid judgmentalism and remain neutral, even though we have strong feelings about the impact of certain kinds of drugs. And that doesn't mean you necessarily have to smile and nod when they say, I'm looking forward to going out and get hammered this weekend. Sure. That's not neutral, that's stupid. You can definitely take a moment and talk about, are you sure that's the wisest decision? What could the natural consequences be? That's not judgmental. That's sharing common sense. The power of the relationship with the couple. And maybe this is something you heard in your very first class. The majority of our power in therapy has to do with the relationship and rapport that we establish. Where'd it go? So, look real quick. I have no idea what that said. It might be a different version of PowerPoint than the one that I created this in. All right, so the goals for